Hello and welcome back to our second Wednesday workshop. I am so happy that you're here. I know that there's a handful of you that have joined us live, so I'm really excited to be able to interact with you all this evening. But also I know that there's a lot of you that are going to be coming and watching this once it is recorded. And obviously it is available on YouTube, as well as our previous Wednesday workshop will be available on YouTube as well. So if this is your first time joining us, please feel free to also watch that one. It'll give some foundation and some context to a little bit of what it is that we're trying to do with all of these sessions. As a reminder, throughout our time together today, please feel free to utilize the chat option, or if you are watching the recorded version, please feel free to utilize the comments in YouTube to be able to share with us thoughts that you're having or questions that you have as you're kind of dealing with and processing some of the information that we're going to be talking about throughout these sessions. Because our goal at Neurologic is always to give you tools and strategies and ideas to help young people. And that's really why we exist. And so we want to make sure that we're doing that. And our best way of doing that is to continue to get information from you. One little thing that we're changing up this time, for those of you that may have been with us last time into this time, is that once again, I'm going to be speaking for about 45 minutes. And so throughout that time, please feel free to put in any questions or comments that you might have. But then for the last 15 minutes, I'm going to ask my colleague, Alexandra Murtaugh, to join me on here. And she's going to help me to answer some of the questions. What we found last time was it was a little tricky for me to read the questions and try and read them and scroll through all the comments that were coming through. And so that way one of us can respond while the other one's looking and so forth. So that's the only difference. You'll get to meet her, and she'll likely be leading some of the future Wednesday workshops that we might do together. So it'll be an excellent opportunity to spend a little bit of time with her. And so other than that, I really want to dive into our kind of content for this evening. And as you know, that is this idea of brain-based de-escalation strategies. I know that's a little bit of a mouthful to even try and get out at one time, but this is such a common thing that is asked of us very often. What are the strategies that we can utilize to help to de-escalate a child, a student, somebody who we happen to be working with, somebody who we are spending any amount of time collaborating with? And it really is a tricky one. And there's a lot of principles that we can really take forward to utilize and implement as we are trying to help and support people. But one of the things that I absolutely want to say up front is simply that there is no one-size-fits-all option. All of the strategies we talk about will work some of the time with some people, but they're not all going to work all the time. And so I want that to be crystal clear up front here. But my hope is that we're going to be sharing some things throughout our time together, or even some kind of methods or approaches that you could take to help in the process of de-escalation that is really going to help to, once again, support the people who you're trying to help and really improve the likelihood that not only is it going to make that moment better, but actually helping to create a cycle where you're going to have fewer and fewer instances in the future of a child reaching a place of escalation where we need to be helping them to get down from there. And so that's really kind of the two-pronged approach that we always want to be taking as we're supporting individuals. Ideally, we're always being proactive, but even in the moments that we're being reactive, we want to make sure that we're being proactive about how we could be avoiding the future escalations, the future issues that we might be facing with some of the students that we're working with. And so we just want to keep that in mind as we're taking this approach to supporting others. We are going to cover some things that we would recommend, and we're also going to cover some things that in most situations we would recommend not doing. But I want to be clear, sometimes the things that we say don't work, they will work as well, but it might just not be the wisest decision from a brain-based perspective to utilize some of those strategies that we might look into. And so just because something works doesn't mean that it's the right strategy or that it's going to be the most advantageous strategy for that child that we're working with. And so those are just some of the things that we, once again, want to keep in mind as we're moving forward with some of this work. And so first and foremost, and I'm not going to spend nearly as much time on this as I did last month, but I want us to always be keeping in mind this basic understanding of the brain. And this is going to be extraordinarily key as we're really thinking about what the work is that we're trying to accomplish here, especially when we're talking about what does it really mean to be escalated, and therefore what does it also mean to be de-escalated. And so as we look at the brain, once again, remembering that we break it into 4 basic regions. And if you want a little more context on this, watch the last month's Wednesday workshop. And so we know that where we want to be is in the cortex. That's where we do our highest level of thinking. That's where we can, do great in school. We can have a great conversation at home. We can do our future planning. That's where we want to be. However, because of stress or because of trauma, many people spend a lot of time operating in lower regions of the brain. And so when you get down into that limbic level of the brain, the first thing that happens is that you all of a sudden become far more emotionally and relationally focused. You're focused on your physical safety and your emotional safety far more than you're focused on learning something new or trying to conquer some problem or plan for something in the future. And then as you get even lower in your brain, you get to that midbrain. And that's that physical part of your brain. That's part of your brain that says, I'm beginning to feel not safe. And you're beginning to act upon that as well. You are going to get more energy literally in your hands and your feet. You're going to be moving. You're going to be walking around. You're going to be touching things. You're going to be just seeking out, do I need to run away from this situation? Do I need to be fighting right now? And you get really physical there. And then when you get all the way to the bottom of your brain, that's where you are in that complete flight, fight, or freeze. You're actively feeling as though you're in the face of danger. So you're actively fighting, you're actively running away, you're actively just trying to survive whatever happens to be going on. And that's what's happening in your body. It's not this thought out response. It is this automated response that your body has to keep you alive and to keep you safe. You do not, once again, tell your heart rate to go up. It goes up automatically when your body senses that you're not safe. And it's going up to send blood to your hands and to your feet. And so there you are with that more likelihood to be physical, to be moving around, to be aggressive with some of the movements that you're having. And so with that information in mind, when we think of the typical behaviors that one would be concerned with when they say that a child is escalated, more often than not, when we're talking with teachers and with schools, the behaviors that they're referring to are very physical behaviors. It's a student that's yelling and screaming or threatening other students very verbally, very much in their face. They're being physical with what they have in their hands. They're throwing something around the room. They're being rough. They're being aggressive in that moment in time. And what's important for us to understand is that in addition to utilizing the word escalation and recognizing what that is, all of that also corresponds with somebody who's likely lower in their brain. And so there is a high probability that a student who is escalated is also a student who's moved down from their cortex and is operating from these lower regions of the brain. And this is extraordinarily important for us to be thinking through as we're contemplating what does it really look like to support a child? Because what we understand with this type of information in mind is that they aren't choosing to behave in the manner in which they're behaving at that point in time. They're not making a conscious decision that, you know what, right now I need to say this thing or I need to do this thing. But really, it is this automated response to stress. It is this automatic response to what's going on around them. And so even though their behaviors often feel personal and they often feel purposeful, the reality is that more often than not, they probably are not intended to be personal, and they probably are not intended to be conducted at all. There is no purpose behind what they're doing. Their body is just responding to stress. And so that is an important piece for us to really be able to grasp as we're thinking about how do we help them. And so to be clear then, a de-escalated student is going to be a student that's higher up in their brain, a student that's operating and accessing their cortex, where they're able to rationally think, where they're able to recognize what might be appropriate in a certain situation and what may not be as appropriate in that specific situation. And so when we take this brain-based approach to understanding de-escalation, what we are really saying is we want to move people from the lower parts of their brain up to the higher parts of their brain. And so there's actually a mantra for this. Many of you have probably heard this before. For those of you who have been through trainings with me in the past, you have likely heard this, which comes from Bruce Perry and the Child Trauma Academy. And it's this idea of regulate, relate, reason. And regulate, relate, reason is essentially this order of operations that is what we need to be thinking through as we're trying to support somebody to move from those bottom parts of the brain and get all the way up to those higher parts of the brain where they are no longer going to be escalated, where they're going to be in a place where they're calm, where they're regulated, where they're able to act and behave in a manner in which you would expect them to for whatever the situation might be. And so if it's a student at school, we're helping to get them ready to be back in the classroom and be learning. If it's a child at home who's learning, similarly, they're going to be calm and ready to re-engage in their work. But also, if it's a child and you're not trying to do school, it's a child that's ready to play with a friend, play with a sibling, sit back at the dinner table and eat their food like they're being asked to. Whatever the instance might be that they were struggling to do prior to that, they're going to be more prepared to be able to, once again, behave in the manner in which we were expecting them to behave at that point in time. And that's what it really means and looks like to bring that level of support to a child and see how we're trying to help them. And so first and foremost, when we're looking at regulation, we're looking at a child and saying, are they as calm as they can ever be? Are they able to focus as much as they ever can? Are they acting as age appropriate as they ever do? As you can hear, there's a lot of qualifiers in there. And obviously we need to take into account the specific thing that perhaps we're trying to accomplish with them at that point in time. But we're really just looking at, are they behaving in the way that you would expect them to right now? And if they are, that's a great sign that they're regulated. But when they're not, and if they are showing signs of being escalated, they are probably not very well regulated in that moment in time. We know that we need to help and support them. We need to provide tools and strategies that are really going to be focused on those lower parts of the brain. We're going to dig into some of the specific things that we could do, but once again, I'd also say that in the previous Wednesday workshop, we dove into a handful of those lower brain tools and interventions, all of which can be utilized to help in a moment as well for this process of de-escalation. But one of the things that I think is so key for us to recognize, and we'll dive more into this as we go, is that when we're starting at those lower parts of the brain, it is so much more about what we do rather than what we say. And I, as a teacher, as somebody who literally obviously speaks for a living, I always want to be talking. I always want to be sharing and rationalizing and talking through and explaining and giving my reasons for the different things that are going on around us. But the truth is, that's not really going to help most people when they're lower in their brain. And so when they're lower in their brain, it's going to be more about different physiological actions that they might be able to do, or how we are going to be responding to them, that's really going to help to begin to move them up higher in their brain. As we get to this relationship piece, this is really kind of that making them feel heard, making them feel connected, making them feel safe. If a child does not feel safe with you, they're going to have a really hard time learning with you and collaborating with you and reestablishing that. And I know for some of us, we think, well, you know, I've had such a good relationship with this student. Of course they feel safe with me. Or I have such a good relationship with my child. Or of course, I'm their parent. They know I love them. And you're right. When they're high up in their brain, they absolutely know that you love them. But when you're getting down lower in your brain, you're disconnecting from that relational part. And your relationships mean less and less and less the lower you get. And so in those moments, sometimes there can be quite a disconnect relationally. And it's important to reestablish that, to take time to communicate, I'm here for you, I care about you, I'm going to support you. And I think this is something that we often skip over so much. We take for granted the fact that I know how I feel about this child, and therefore I'm assuming that they know that, and maybe it's even reciprocated back. And the reality is that's not always happening, especially the lower and lower we get in the brain. And then when we get all the way up to the top, that reason part, that's just us, once again, hopefully being able to A, accomplish whatever it was that we were trying to do in the first place, but B, this is the part of the brain we need to be in to be able to process whatever the experience was that we just went through. And so as we get up to that top part of the brain, that's when we're finally going to be in a place where we could say, okay, here's why we don't do this behavior or that behavior, and being able to really think through and process what does that mean and what does that look like. So in an ideal world, we're obviously being proactive. We're always thinking about a child's level of regulation. Is the relationship in order? And then we're in a great spot to do that reasoning work with them. But obviously, the reason that we're here today, the reason we're having this training, is that there are times that students get escalated. There are times that a child is going to get upset for one reason or another. Sometimes it's things they're carrying into a situation that doesn't directly involve us. And sometimes it's things that we're doing that causes them to get escalated. And when that happens, this is an unbelievable process to be able to take to help to support them, to help them to become de-escalated, to get them back up to those higher parts of the brain where they're really ready to process through what happened and move on with some of the events that we're hoping they're able to do. So I actually want to share two stories with you this evening. The first is about a student of mine. We'll call him Joey. And this is when he was 17 years old. Many of you who have been through training before have heard this story, and we're going to be utilizing this to kind of talk through a lot of the de-escalation strategies throughout the rest of this talk today. The second story I want to share is actually about my son, who I see said hi to me on the chat here. So hi, Mather. When he was just about 3 years old. And what I want to really be able to do with both of those stories is, for one, I think that it's important that we recognize that the brain, whether it is 3 years old or whether it is 17 years old, and quite frankly, even much more beyond that, it operates in a similar way. And this kind of process of regulate, relate, reason, though some of the specifics will certainly look different because of the age, because of the context and relationship, that the basic process is the same. And it helps to be able to do that de-escalation that we want to be able to accomplish. So the first story, a student of mine, his name is Joey, 17 years old. He's in class one day, not my class, another teacher's class. And I'm assuming that he's having a rough day because the teacher says to him, if you do one more thing, I'm going to send you to the behavior management office. A few minutes after he said that, the student sitting next to Joey threw something in the room. The teacher assumed it was Joey and sent him to the behavior management office. Joey went to the office and he tried to explain, it wasn't me, it was this other student, I shouldn't be here right now. And after several minutes of going back and forth, whether it was reality or his perspective, I'm not quite sure. But Joey came to the conclusion that even though I did not do this thing, I am going to get blamed for it. And when that happened, Joey snapped. He started yelling and screaming, completely escalated, completely in those bottom parts of his brain. He's throwing things around the room, started with, pieces of paper from the desk and pens and pencils and clipboards and books, and moved on up to chairs and tables. And there are these two large wooden cubbies in the room that he slammed his hands down on. They broke into pieces, fell on the floor. He's completely destroying this space. And so as he's doing that, the person who's in the room with him, at least at first, is trying to rationalize with him, trying to say, hey, it's not that big a deal. We can work through this. Why don't you just tell me what happened? And all of that stuff, which is kind and supportive and simple, is higher up in the brain than Joey is ready to operate at that point in time. And so a couple minutes later, they called me. I was down the hall. I happened not to have a class that period. They said, Josh, can you come talk to Joey? He's completely losing it. And I said, yeah, of course. And I walk into the room and I take one look at him and I'm like, my relationship with this kid means nothing right now. I could go over there, put my arm around him, say, hey, what's going on, bud? But that next chair is just going to come my direction. And the reason for that is that he is lower in his brain than that limbic level. He's in that more reactive part of the brain. He's not ready to respond and really work with me in that moment from a friendship. And so while my familiarity was enough to let me walk in the room, it's not enough to actually calm him down and regulate him at that moment in time because he's lower in his brain than that. And so instead of attempting to talk to him, I ran upstairs and I grabbed 2 large cups of water. Then I came back to the room where he was and I reached my hand out and I said, you look thirsty, bud. You want some water? And thankfully, he reached his hand out and he took that water and he started drinking it. And I just stood next to him and I said, take slow sips, take slow sips. Now, it might seem like I was just trying to hydrate him for his next round of furniture throwing. But the truth is, water is extremely regulating. As we drink water, it actually softens the bags of our lungs, which allows oxygen to more freely flow up to our brain. It's good for our hydration, which is great for the functionality of our brain. But third, and perhaps most importantly, is that drinking water is kind of like a breathing exercise. If he tried to drink that water quickly, he would have spilled it all over himself. I did not take his pulse when I went in there, but I would imagine it was at 140, 150. His chest was going a million miles a minute. And so to drink that water, he had to slow his breathing down. And as you slow your breathing down, that is an unbelievable tool to really help at that brainstem level. And so for a student, especially an older student, they're likely not going to buy into when they're very escalated. Hey, let's do some square breaths right now. Hey, breathe into a count of 6 and then let's breathe out. That's likely something that they're not going to buy into, but they probably will buy into a drink of water. Because quite frankly, as you're getting escalated, you're sweating, you're getting worked up, your body is actually craving that. And what is at the bottom of your brain is your basic needs. And so he could recognize that he needed water in that moment in time. And so he was going to be far more receptive to be able to reach out and take that water as I offered it to him, which sure enough he did. And so as he drank that water, I just stood next to him. And the only thing I said to him was, take slow sips, take slow sips. Now, it is so tempting at a moment like that, that now the student has his hands with a bottle of water, so he's not throwing the furniture around, he's not doing anything like that. He's got the bottle in his mouth, so he's no longer talking, yelling, cursing. It is so tempting to use that moment of silence to start talking at the child, to start telling them all the things that they did wrong, all the consequences for their actions and everything. But the truth is, they are still in the bottom of their brain. They are still dysregulated in that moment in time. And they are not ready to hear that yet, because all of that, the consequences for actions, the rationale behind them, the discussion of what happened, that is all cortical. And that's something that a child is not ready to do when they're down at the bottom of their brain. And so all the bottom of their brain can take in a moment like that is very, very simple directions. And so way more important than what happened yet, way more important than its consequences, is take slow sips. Take slow sips. And then that is what's going to help to begin that process of calming him down. Once he finished that first cup, I handed him a second cup, and I walked past him and I started cleaning stuff up from around the room. Just the small stuff, the pens, the pencils, the pieces of paper, and just kind of keeping an eye on him as I did that. And then I noticed as he finished that second cup of water, I walked over to a large piece of wood from that wooden cubby that he'd broken. I bent down, I said, hey, bud, this is too heavy for me. Can you help me pick this up? And thankfully, he walked over next to me, and together we picked that up and we leaned it against the wall. And then together we actually walked around the room and picked up the rest of the furniture and put it back as best we could. Now, what I want to be crystal clear about here is that no part of me said or implied to him, you made this mess, you better clean it up. Because that's cortical. Once again, he's not up there yet. Trying to make a consequence right then and there is not an effective time to do that. Will there be consequences for his actions? Yeah, there will. Is now the time to dish them out? Absolutely not. And in fact, I began by modeling to him that I'm going to be the one cleaning up this room. And I picked up all of that small stuff. And then when I walked over to that large piece of wood, I didn't say, you need to come over here. You did this, you better. I said, hey, can you help me with this? He had a choice. And had he said no, I would have moved on to something else. But the reason I wanted him to help me is that utilizing your large muscles in a controlled way is a great way to actually calm down and activate those lower regions of your brain, specifically the midbrain. And so with that in mind, when you're thinking of other situations where you're trying to support and help somebody, recognize that getting them to utilize their muscles is a great tool. If they are going to be able to listen to you at all, getting them to be like, hey, can you carry this box for me? Can you do this one thing for me? Can you help me in this way? Where they're able to utilize their muscles, that's something that's going to be extraordinarily beneficial for them. And that's going to help that process of calming them down and getting them up to those higher regions of the brain where we want them to be. And so once we had finished putting the room back together as best we could, I looked at him and I saw that those eyes that were darting around the room when I first came in, they could now focus on me. He was no longer exhibiting the behaviors of concern, yelling, cursing, throwing things around. And so he seemed regulated. And so the next step then is relationship. I knew that now my relationship with him mattered. And so we spent the next little while just chatting, just talking. And once again, this is such a key piece not to step over. It'd be so easy to say, okay, he's a little bit calm now. Let's give him the consequences and move on. And I know that at home, at school, in the community, there's always so much to do. But it's so important that we recognize that we need to go at the child's pace. They don't care about our pace. And their ability to de-escalate does not go at our pace either. We need to match their pace. We need to slow down and we need to prioritize them in that moment if we're going to be able to help to support them to get to the level of calm that they need to get to and that we will both benefit from them eventually getting to. And so I spent the next few minutes just talking to Joey, just chatting back and forth about things that I knew that he was interested in. We talked about sports, we talked about dirt biking and video games, and we had inside jokes from my class. And so we're just chatting back and forth for probably 5 to 8 minutes about nothing about that day. And we're just having that conversation. And the reality is that through that, even though I did not specifically articulate this, the goal is that I wanted him to hear that, or to be thinking really, this is Josh. I have a good relationship with Josh. Josh has always respected me. I respect him. I like him. And so I wanted that to be reestablished as our relationship because he needed to remember that. He felt kind of this disconnect from the situation. He felt unsafe and he needed to remember I'm with somebody who I can feel safe with. And that's important for our children. Before we get to dishing out any kind of consequences, before we get to really even digging into what happened that day, we need to make sure that they're with somebody that they feel safe with and that safety has been reestablished if anything has occurred that's going to make it difficult for them to feel connected with that person in the moment. Or else when we jump to that reasoning piece, it's either going to be less effective or it's going to be far more likely to trigger them in the future. And so then when we get up to that reasoning with Joey, so after talking to him for a while, I felt like that connection was there. And then we could get into the, hey, bud, we need you to go home. You're probably not going to be at school tomorrow. There's going to be some bills to pay for some of this stuff that we broke. And so we could look through some of those consequences. But he was in a spot now where he was able to hear that. He was able to reflect and recognize, what? My response did not match what happened there earlier. And I get that doesn't belong in a school. And recognize that therefore consequences were necessary because of really what had gone down there that day. He was able to advocate for himself, asking to stay in another room to wait for his ride to come because he felt too closed off, asking us to call other people and tell them what happened so that he did not have to relive that once he got home that night. And so he was able to kind of do all of that, which is cortical. Advocating for yourself is cortical. Processing what events happen today, that's cortical. Recognizing what's going to upset you in the future, that's cortical. But you can't access your cortex if you're not in a spot where that relationship's in place and if the lower parts of your brain are not regulated. You're going to have a really tough time getting to do that cortical work if that lower brain stuff is not established. One more piece of this that I want to share, which is something that I learned about Joey several months after this event, but I think is really important for our mindset as we're trying to support students, is, once again, something I learned afterwards that I was not aware of on this day. And that's that before Joey was born, Joey's mother had an affair with her husband's best friend, and Joey was the result of that affair. Upon finding out, Joey's mother's husband got pretty upset and they ended up getting a divorce. But they lived in such a low socioeconomic area that they stayed living together and absolutely hating each other. And they let Joey know every single day of his life that he was the reason for all the anger and hatred in that home. Joey's biological father lived 2 blocks away. Joey's biological father made it crystal clear that he wanted nothing to do with Joey because Joey was a reminder of how he lost his best friend. And when I heard that story, I immediately thought back to the day that Joey got upset because he got blamed for something someone else did. And immediately it made all the sense in the world. Immediately I was able to put together that he has spent his whole life being blamed for something that was not his fault. Of course, when that happens in school, that's going to be something that triggers him. That's going to be something that upsets him. Now, without that context, I had no idea that day. But once again, as we talked about so much in the first workshop, our work is about giving children the benefit of the doubt. Our work is about recognizing that there is a whole story there that we don't necessarily know about. But that when we see a student behaving a certain way, we want to assume that maybe if we happen to know the whole story, it would make so much more sense. But our job is not to know the whole story. Our job is to support the child. And so we don't need to know what was going on in their head at that moment. We don't need to know the specifics of everything that's happened in their life, but we can assume that everybody wants to do well. Everybody wants to be good. But when they are struggling to behave that way, when they're having difficult moments, something else is getting in the way. And we just need to assume that there's something else behind it that is unrelated to what we need to know right now, because our job is simply to help, is simply to support. And that's how we're going to help in this process. Second story, once again, with my son when he was about 3 years old. I had come home kind of late from work one day. I remember that I was pretty tired. I was, coming in just as my family was sitting down to eat. And I kind of just made a beeline for my seat at the dinner table. I think just a little tired, probably dysregulated after my long day. And I sat down and I remember my son next to me and he said, basically, trying to touch base with me. And I was just probably a really quick response to him. And I was ready to dive into my food. And before I could dive into my food, all of a sudden he knocks down this little, sippy cup of milk and it starts spilling out on the floor. And it seemingly was on purpose, probably obvious to you. And so I clean it up and I say, hey, bud, I can't let you do that. Don't want these messes. So I clean it up, I put it back on his plate. And now here I am about to dive into my dinner again. And sure enough, he knocks it down again. And so now I'm getting more and more frustrated because all I wanted to do was eat. And now here I am cleaning up milk again. And I said, all right, I need you to not do that again. If you do, you're going to have to go in the other room. And sure enough, stupid me cleans up the milk, puts it on there, and he, sure enough, knocks it down again. And now I am completely flustered and frustrated because all I cared about was trying to eat my dinner, and I'm not able to do it now. And so once again, there's basic needs not being met for me. And so I pick him up and say, okay, you asked for it. And we start walking over to a chair where we were, attempting to do time in. And he just went into a full-on tantrum. He is yelling and screaming as a 3-year-old understandably would. And I am completely dysregulated myself, frustrated, trying to rationalize. I told you if you did this, we were going to walk in here, and just going back and forth like this is the consequence that you earned, trying to rationalize with my tantruming 3-year-old son. Obviously, that's not going well. I'm getting more and more frustrated. My son is getting more and more frustrated, or at least not stopping his tantruming and crying. And thankfully, my wife is in the other room and eventually kind of comes in very calmly, is able to take my son into her arms. And I walk into the other room. I take a moment to kind of have that deep breath. And I just kind of have that palm to forehead moment where I'm like, people pay me to tell them how to handle dysregulated people. And here I am doing it completely wrong. And so I take a minute to kind of gather myself because I'm realizing, all right, I'm not in a good spot right now. And so I clean that last spot of milk up, put that back together, take a deep breath. And I just think, all right, how do I help him right now? What do I need to do right now? And so I grab a plate and I grabbed a bunch of pieces of paper and I tore it up into these tiny little pieces and I put it on the plate. And I walked out to the room where my wife was still holding him. And I got down at his level and they were sitting in a chair and I got down and I was like, hey, bud, I want you to blow all of these little pieces of paper off this plate. And he kind of looked at me odd and still threw the, full-on 3-year-old tantrum. And then I blow on the plate and you see some of those little pieces of paper jump up in the air a little bit. And I said, but I want you to blow all these pieces of paper off the plate. And so then he started to take deep breaths and blow on that to blow those pieces of paper off. Now, he was in a full tantrum. He was a young kid. And so it took quite a few tries before he was able to blow all those off. And it probably took a couple minutes of deep breath after deep breath after deep breath. And so when we're working with young kids, similar to what I said about Joey, he's likely not going to buy into, hey, let's do some square breathing right now, or let's do some other type of very ritualized breathing exercise. But let's not be afraid to have fun. It's okay to have fun. And so I knew that this was something that he would buy into, that he would think is kind of fun, making a mess, even though I just was mad at him for making a mess, but he was able to buy into that. And so he was able to take deep breath after deep breath after deep breath to really be able to push through that and blow all those pieces of paper off. And by the time he did, I could see that now those tears were beginning to go away. He was beginning to calm down. And so now I just took him into my arms and I held him. Obviously, I'm not going to do this with a student, but I do this with my own child. And now it's reestablishing that relationship. So that breathing is down at the bottom of the brain. And now it's that reestablishment of the relationship where he's hearing, I love you, I care about you, I'm always here to support you. And so going through that again and again with him so that he knows that. And once again, not jumping to the next steps yet, but spending a moment living in that just need to reestablish that relationship. And then once that was accomplished, then it was, let's go back and eat. And by the way, this is why we don't spill milk in our house, and being able to kind of converse about that. And I can honestly say that I don't think he's spilled milk in our house since then. But another piece of all that is that I needed to be able to connect with him. And I also needed to be able to apologize to him and let him know the role that I played in that. Because you know what? I came home and I didn't respect him. I didn't show him the love that he needed right there. And I needed to be able to kind of process through that myself, talk to him about better ways to communicate it with me and beginning to teach that, which understandably is a process for a younger child. But I also need to learn as well that, you know what, when that milk gets knocked down the first time, it's time to pay attention to him and not my dinner. And so making sure that this is really kind of that two-way street that we're trying to really think through as we're trying to provide that level of support to a child. And so with that in mind, I do want to talk through this process a bit more and share some more ideas and strategies that go along with it. But one of the first key elements to all of this is that the regulation starts with the adult. Whether you are a parent, whether you are a teacher, whether you are a coach, whether you are just a sibling, someone else who's interacting with the child in the community, you are very important in this process of helping that child to become regulated. And one of the first key steps is that we need to make sure that we are regulated first. I need to be able to ask, do I feel calm right now? And pay attention to this. In both of those stories that I shared, there is a need for a second person to be involved in that. And so that need to kind of call for help, because you know what? That person who was in that office when Joey was sent, they called and asked for me. When I was trying to deal with my son and support him, my wife came to the rescue because I wasn't in a good spot to do it. And so a big piece of this is recognizing ideally that there's someone else. And so for those that are in schools and have systems like that in place, make sure that there's a system where you can ask for help and working through that so that you can get somebody else in there when you ask yourself, do I feel calm? And the answer is no. And so making sure that we are doing everything we can to really support and help in that moment. A big piece of this is that question of, am I taking this too personally? And I think that happens often. Once again, as a parent and as someone who taught for a number of years, I know that in both realms, it always felt so personal. But the truth is, more often than not, it isn't actually personal, but it feels that way in the moment. When I'm teaching and a child is becoming escalated, it feels like they're being rude to me. It feels like they're disrupting what I'm trying to do. It feels like they are disrespecting me and creating this kind of power struggle with me. But if I'm taking it personal, my response is going to be with more power. And so we then create this kind of back and forth with them where more and more struggle is really beginning to come out there. And when power meets power, it's usually reciprocated by even more power. And so it just kind of keeps going back and forth, getting more and more negative and ramping things up instead of having that opportunity to help anybody to really calm down in that situation. And so also, I think one of the key things as we're contemplating if we're regulated right now is really, can we even stop for that moment and recognize where this behavior is coming from. And I don't even mean the long story behind it. I just mean the simple fact of, oh, this is a child that's low in their brain right now. This is a child that needs help and support right now. And so that's what's so key then, is thinking through, what is my goal? Because if my goal is punishment, if the only thing I really want to jump to is, what is your consequence for this thing that you are doing right now, I'm probably not in a very good spot. But if my goal is support, if my goal is recognizing this is a child that needs help right now. A quote that I like is that it's not, is this child giving me a hard time? It's that this child is having a hard time right now. And being able to recognize that. And if they're having a hard time, then there's that level of support that they need, so that we're able to come around them and think, what are those specific things that I might be able to do to help them? And so if all we're focused on is punishment, if we don't feel calm, we really need to be asking, do we need to do this right now? Or are we able to wait? Or are we able to bring in some help and support? Or is there anything that I'm able to do in the moment to help myself to become a little calmer? Because the bottom line is, in that moment, we're probably not really in a great spot to be able to respond to that child. But assuming that we're able to bring somebody in who is able to help, there's some pretty good ideas for what we might want to attempt and some things that we might want to avoid as we're helping them to become regulated at that bottom part of the brain, as we're really helping to bring about that process of de-escalation. One of the keys is really focusing in on those basic needs. And so with that in mind, think about Joey in the water. Think about just, are those basic needs being met? If a student is hungry, if a student is thirsty, if a student is cold or hot, if a student's basic needs aren't being met, if their physicality is not where it needs to be, if they need to use the restroom, they're not going to be able to handle things as well. And so often, things that lead to de-escalation are actually them asking for, can I go to the bathroom? I need a snack right now. Can I go get a drink of water? They're even seeking out basic needs. And when we are, for one reason or another, not able to provide that when they need it, or we've chosen not to allow them to have it at that time, that often is something that can lead to that de-escalation. And so seeing, hey, can I get you a drink right now? Hey, do you need something to snack on right now? And how can we provide some of those basic things for them? That is going to be very helpful in those moments in time. Positive body language. One of the things I think is really important for us to realize is that a child who's lower in their brain pays far more attention to nonverbal communication than they do to verbal communication. Meaning that the words that we're saying have less meaning than how we're saying them and what our body is telling them. If our body looks frustrated and annoyed and angry, that's the message that we're sending them. So even if we happen to be saying the right thing, if our body is telling a different story, we're not really setting that child up for a whole lot of success in that moment in time. And so we need to be able to recognize that within them and to be able to pay attention to that. A practice that I've asked a lot of teachers to do over the years, and quite frankly, you can do this at home, and it's even easier to do for classrooms now because of Zoom, is take a video of yourself for a class period or for a portion of a day, and then watch it back on mute. And as you watch it back, simply ask yourself, what messages is my body language sending? Am I smiling? Am I happy? Am I embracing? Or am I kind of closed off? Do I look annoyed? Do I look frustrated? And recognize that what you're feeling as you watch that muted version of yourself is what a lot of your your escalated students are experiencing. That's what some of the things are that they're going to be seeing at that time. And so with that in mind, some other ideas that are things that are worth attempting: encouragement. Sometimes just catching them off guard with, hey, I see that you want to be singing right now. I see you have a lot of energy. It sounds awesome. Say something positive as we're then transitioning into what that redirection might be, or simply say something positive in that moment and leave it there. Because if they're acting up and there has been a pattern before that they act up and they get in trouble, they're going to be expecting something negative to come their direction. And when we can instead bring about something positive, encourage them, let them hear something good, sometimes that can have enough shock value that it kind of sets them off a little bit, takes them off of what was expected, and can begin to set them on kind of a more positive path moving forward. The art of distraction can sometimes go well, especially if you link it in with something positive. So even thinking of the story with my son, that ability to just be distracted by making a mess and blowing those tiny pieces of paper on the floor, that's something that can be helpful. Sometimes it could be just, hey, let's look at this, or telling a story, or watching something, figuring out something else that we can redirect our focus in on. Sometimes it's distraction with, brain breaks that we've taught them that just take a lot of our mental energy focused on something very simple. When somebody is escalated as well, sometimes the best thing to do is separate them from the situation, especially if there's siblings or classmates around. They're just watching them. There's an audience, and that ups the stress level. And so I'm a big fan of, in your classroom, have a spot, have a corner that's for, calming down, for regulation, that not only is separated, but also has something that can kind of take away the line of vision that they might have from their students or from their classmates. Obviously, we still need to see every student, including that one, to make sure they're safe. But if there can be a little blockage from them, that's something that's really helpful. Sometimes it's asking them to take a walk with you. And in severe cases, it might be asking the rest of the class to leave so that we can work one-on-one with that child. Obviously, we need other adults to help us in a situation like that. But as we can separate them more, that's one thing that helps to bring that stress level down. And we're going to be able to improve the likelihood that they're going to buy into something that's meant to regulate, that's meant to help really support them in that moment. Providing choices is key. So not telling them this is what you have to do, but similar, hey, can you help me lift this thing up right now? Or, hey, would you rather blow bubbles or blow these tiny pieces of paper around? Would you rather take a walk with this person or take a walk with that person? Would you rather keep working on your assignment, or would you rather go to the calming corner in the classroom? So giving them choices, that's empowering, that reduces stress quickly and can put them in a great spot. And I'm a big fan as well of the flyby redirection. That's where you just kind of go by and you say, like, hey, I need you to stop whatever it is. And then we turn and walk away. So often we'll stay and wait for that behavior to stop. If a boss were to come to me and tell me that there's something that I'm not doing right at work, and then stand over me and wait for me to have an opportunity to do that thing again and do it right, that would drive me insane. But we do that to students all the time. Here's what I need you to stop doing. And then we stare at them and wait for them to screw up or to stop doing that thing. And so I'm a big fan of, I'm going to say, hey, I need you to stop talking, or I need you to stop yelling, or I need you to stop whatever it is you're doing. And then I'm going to turn and walk away, because I'm showing them, I trust you. I think you can handle this. I'm removing myself from the situation, but I'm putting them in a spot where they're going to be more likely to be able to succeed. And so then with some things that we might want to avoid, for one, leading with punishment. So easy, you see a behavior, or so often we see a behavior and we just want to lead in with, all right, you have lunch detention. All right, that's a suspension. All right, you're grounded. All right, here's what you lost. And leading in with that, all it does is ups that stress level right away. And so instead, we want to really be thinking through, once again, that support and not what is that punishment. This does not mean that there are never punishments. I want to be clear about that. This does not mean that there are never consequences. You need to establish boundaries and do things that make sense in your home, in your classrooms, in your schools, in your facilities. But this is about recognizing when the right time is to really be thinking through that. Negative body language, we talked about that. And so thinking about what not to do. Yelling is a key one that is often going to be triggering. Yelling can be effective. I'm not going to lie. For the short term, it can be effective. It can get somebody to stop doing it, but all you're doing is triggering their fear response and getting compliance out of them. It doesn't up their level of safety. It does not prepare them to learn, and it improves the likelihood that they're going to be doing that same behavior again in the future, because it's not actually supporting them. It's just stopping something in the moment. Yelling can be effective if it's a dangerous situation, somebody's fighting, somebody's hurting themselves or others. There's a time that raising a voice can be effective right there, but it's not a good go-to tool. Similarly, aggressive movements, thinking about, does it look like I'm coming at the student? Are they interpreting me as coming at them, looking down at them, closing in on them? Or are they recognizing that I'm coming from really this overarching place of support with them? Being sarcastic, they can't really read into that in that moment in time. And micromanaging, this is one that I've seen a lot. there's one big behavior that we're worried about, and then suddenly we start to find 20 smaller behaviors. Now it's not just the word that you said, but now it's how you're walking, how you're talking, how your shoes are tied, how you're looking at somebody. And so we get so hyper-focused with a little bit of everything that we then make the problem seem so much more. And once again, each one of those things just turns into more and more issues that are coming out. And so then real quick, once again, we don't want to skip over the relational piece. I know I'm going slightly over my promised time before questions, but that need to kind of asking, like, is there a repair that needs to happen? And so taking time to connect with the child on a personal level. Remember, it's not always about the situation at hand. It's reestablishing that relationship and reestablishing that role with the child. And so I'm here for you. I care about you. I'm your teacher. I'm your parent, whatever it might be. But spending time just treating them like a human, because they are, and being able to have that moment with them. Thinking through, do I need to apologize? And what is the child's perspective? Because maybe I didn't technically do something wrong, but I recognize that they feel as though I did. And so being able to just stop and say, hey, I'm really sorry that you felt this way, or I'm really sorry that that you thought that I was yelling at you, or that you felt whatever. Taking the time to do that, apologizing to students or children have been some of the most meaningful conversations that I've been able to have with them. And so once again, it's so key, even though I'm rushing through it right now for time's sake, not to rush through this relational side of things. And then lastly is that reasoning. And this is another one that we also don't want to be skipping through. We're recognizing that this is where a child is now ready to do whatever it was that we were asking them to do. So, we're able to ask, are they in a good spot now to be able to move forward? If there are consequences for whatever happened, now is a time that they're going to be more ready to be able to handle those consequences, receive whatever those consequences might be. And be ready to kind of interpret that. And sometimes this reasoning piece isn't going to happen immediately after. You could come back days after to really have that conversation. And really also what I think is so key is to then take the time to look back at a situation and say, all right, how would we avoid this in the future? And taking time to really collaborate with the child to be able to accomplish that, to be able to make sure that in the future we have strategies in place and supports in place, so that hopefully we do not land in this exact same spot again. Because once again, our goal is to be able to come to them from that place of support and to make a plan with them so that we can be proactive about these future possibilities, these future opportunities to be able to support them again. So I am once again going to invite Alexandra to come onto the screen now. And we are going to attempt to address some of the questions that have come in. And please, if you have any other questions, feel free to share.
Sure. So, Josh, I'm actually going to highlight the one question here if you want to tackle this one. So Carrie said that she's a 5th grade teacher, and she wants to know how you feel about having a calm down corner in a classroom. Or having a buddy teacher to send a semi-escalated student to.
Yeah. So first and foremost, I think that yes, having a calm down space in the classroom is amazing. Once again, and I know that maybe that came in slightly before I even alluded to it, but being able, and Alexandra, can you actually mute your spot so that my voice isn't coming through? It was echoing slightly. And so having that spot that they're able to come into is so important so that they're able to kind of get that separation from where they're at. And what I love about having a calming place in the classroom is that if every time a child is escalated, they have to leave the room, what that's telling them is that they can only regulate outside of that classroom. And so when you have spaces within the classroom that really support that level of regulation, that's really going to help to support them to learn, all right, I can escalate here. Now, with that said, having a buddy teacher to send a semi-escalated student to, I don't have any issues with that. I think that there's, once again, a time and a place for that. But I would imagine I would not choose one strategy or the other. I would imagine that both strategies can work really well. The one thing that I would say about having that buddy teacher is really thinking, what do they have in their room? Is there a place that they have? Is there a purpose that I've chosen that teacher as that buddy? Because perhaps that's a teacher that is really great relationally, has time to check in with a student. And when that's the case, there can really be that level of positivity that can really help and support that child, which is a very, very good thing. If it's just a holding place for the child and it's coming across like, I'm just trying to get you out of my hair right now, and so you're kicking them out of the room, if it feels like that to the child, it's not going to be as positive a place for them to go. So I would really kind of think through, what's the plan, what's the process, how are you sending the student out or encouraging them to go to that buddy teacher's room. All of it is really in the process, and it's one of those things that can be amazingly supportive, or it could feel really punitive and adding more stress in that moment.
Yeah, the only piece that I would add to that is just when a student is headed to another classroom or to another teacher, you don't want them to think that if they're leaving your room that they would need to leave in order to get kind of the regulation that they need. And that's why, that again could be good if you as the teacher are frustrated in that moment, or you need that separation, which is helpful. But if they start to associate in their own brains, oh, every time I'm escalated or upset, I'm going to this other teacher and I'm not staying in my classroom, then it becomes the classroom is a dysregulating space and outside of the classroom is a regulating space. And those associations are created very quickly in our brains. So attempting to avoid that is probably important. So the next question we have here from Karen: once we give students the tools to regulate, should we see them begin to regulate on their own?
So that's a great question. And what I'd say is it's a long process. And it depends a bit upon the age, the circumstances, the situation that we're finding them in. But part of that reasoning process is that you can begin to really, after this has occurred, teach a student the tools that would help them. I often think of regulation in the same way that people would approach, practicing a fire drill. The purpose of practicing a fire drill is that you hear the alarm and you now know exactly how I exit my classroom or my office to get into that safe place. And so even if you're in a stressful environment, you've gone through the motions enough times that even though it's stressful, you can get to that safe place. Well, I think regulation is similar. You're teaching a child that when you feel a certain way, or when a certain thing might be happening around you that you might know is frustrating, whether it is even a teacher or a class subject, or if it's, I know that I get mad when somebody says this word or when somebody talks this way, or once again, as students get older, though this is a developed skill, but identifying some of their emotions. But as they can work to identify some of that, they can learn, hey, that tool that the teacher taught me is something that I can actually do on my own. Whether it's a breathing exercise, whether it's a request to leave the room, whether it is utilizing an intervention or a tool that's going to help to calm them down or distract them, whatever that might be, that is a great ultimate goal. But what I would say is that it can take time. And for some, it'll take a lot of time, especially when we're recognizing that sometimes the issue is stress in the moment, and sometimes the issue is how the brain has literally been developed. And also, when we don't necessarily know, once again, if we are a teacher and not the home life, we might not know what's happening in the home life that can be really stressful, making it difficult for some of those self-regulatory skills to really, take off instead of being practiced 24 hours a day. And so I would just say, to be clear, yes, it's something to teach, but don't get discouraged if after 2 or 3 weeks, the child is not able to do it on their own. Everyone's going to develop that skill at their own pace. And once again, I would just recognize that it, like so many other things, is a skill that needs to be developed.
So I think we probably have time just for this last final question. Does any of what you've said about, de-escalation strategies change when it is an adult that we're dealing with?
Yeah. So, and honestly, we've had a lot of great opportunities to work with businesses, with, those that work in, police departments, fire departments, et cetera. And really, a lot of it is the same basic process. I mean, whether, I know that I used examples of a 3-year-old, a 17-year-old, but the brain at 70 is similar as well, in that as we get stressed, we move to the lower parts. And our goal is to activate those lower parts so that we can begin to sequentially move back up to the higher parts. That's what the de-escalation practice looks like. And so the same list of things, the do's and the don'ts, would be applying whether you're talking to an adult or whether you're talking to a child. Yelling is likely not going to work. Belittling them is likely not going to work. Being sarcastic is likely not going to work. Showing love and support, thinking through our body language as we are really responding to them, taking time to listen to their point of view, and even just putting time and space between the discussions. The beauty of many adult interactions that doesn't always exist when we're dealing with younger children is that we often have time. We can often create some of the time that we might need or want to be able to put between some of what those interactions might be. And we can identify, you know what, I'm just not in a good spot to have this discussion. And it's okay to even look at it and say, I'm not, or if you recognize that you are interacting with somebody else and they want to do the conversation here and now, but you can tell that they're not in a good spot, it's okay to even say to them, I'm not in a good spot to have this conversation right now, because you're putting that space between it. You're recognizing that it's just going to turn into this kind of power struggle. And so you're finding a way out without adding any more stress to them in that moment in time. Because the more stress that we're putting on that adult, the more it's just going to ramp that situation up. So the short answer is the strategies are the same. All we want to do is just make sure that we are making it seem age appropriate for the individual that we happen to be working with at that time. And so as we can really consider that and put that into practice, we can really take those same basic steps, that same process and those same tools, and apply it with people of absolutely any age, and just making sure it makes sense in the setup that we happen to be in. So I believe that is all of our questions. So thank you once again so much for your time. We look forward to diving into next month, where we're going to be talking about harnessing the plasticity of the brain. As always, if you have more questions that you would like to ask, please feel free to reach out to us and follow us on any social media, or reach out and send us an email. We would love to hear from you with whatever it is that you want to talk about. And we are also really excited to just keep hearing. We've been getting a lot of great questions from people as we begin to think about kind of our next series of Wednesday workshops and some of the work that we might want to do down the line. So we would love to hear from you and what ideas you might have for that. So thank you so much, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.